overwhelming favorite, and his army is the overwhelming favorite to win this battle. Why? Because Lee hasn't lost. Lee hasn't lost. It's like you have an undefeated team. What I liken it to is, and none of you were around, but I think in the late 80s, the Miami Dolphins had a really bad football team. But it was led by a really good quarterback, and his name was? Come on. Dan Marino. That's why I pointed at you. Dan Marino. And in comes a juggernaut, a super football team. A football team that was going to rival the Dolphins' mythical undefeated season. This team had been undefeated, and that was the Chicago Bears. And it was headed by almost a mythical character, which was a Ditka. Ditka was the lead, and it had this like scrambling quarterback, Jim, I believe his name was Jim McMahon. So they arrived, and the Dolphins had had a terrible season. It was really the only team that really stood in the way of the undefeated season. The Dolphins are the only team to ever have an undefeated season. And on that day, on that night, the Dolphins and Marino found a way of defeating the Chicago Bears. It was the only loss that the Chicago Bears would have that year. But it saved the Dolphins' undefeated season. They're still the only team that has gone through an entire season undefeated. And it defeated this overwhelming favorite. Well, when Lee arrives ultimately at Gettysburg, he's the unquestioned proposed winner. But that's why you fight things, right? That's why you play games. And he expected to win just by showing up. And sometimes that is a lesson. Have you ever been in a sporting event where you think that you're so good and the other team is so bad that just by showing up you're going to win? Yeah. And then you realize, hey, it's not that easy because that team is not laying down and letting us win. And that's what happened with the North. First, Lee made a number of mistakes. Mistake number one. Back then, there weren't any satellites. There weren't any little, remote control drone planes to tell you where the enemy was. The only way that you would find out is if you had scouts, not Boy Scouts, but scouts that would go out and look for the enemy. Generally, your scouts were on horseback because they had to cover large territory. So Lee's eyes in the field were a division of cavalry that was led by a general who, at that time, wanted to find his own glory. So he was off in the north doing all sorts of things and not really paying attention to what he was doing. Because, of course, Lee doesn't really need me that much. He wins on his own luck. So he's out there, and Lee's army bump into a northern division. Lee's not ready to fight. Why? Because when you're a military general, you want to fight in the best ground available for you. You want to have the natural resources that you want available. You want to be on the high ground. You want to be in all these things. So Lee had given an order not to engage the North. And one of his generals arrives and sees a group of northern soldiers. What he thought were northern soldiers that were there to steal cows and to grab things that the army would need. He didn't think it was a big deal. So he decides to go against Lee's order not to engage. Because how dare these people do what they're doing? And then he begins an engagement and realizes he's made a mistake. Because since there's no one to tell them where the North is, he's made a mistake and he's run into an entire cavalry. But that's okay because Lee's entire army is here ready to attack. So he engages them in a ground that isn't very beneficial to the south, but he thinks, we're going to win very quickly. What he doesn't know is that the northern army is about to arrive. And when they begin their engagement, the North is able to get the better ground, which means that the North was fighting on hills and the South was fighting below. Ultimately, when his head of the cavalry arrives, Lee decides, and his other generals are saying, look, this is not a good ground. Let's leave, let's retreat, let's go to a place where it's better for us. But he's like, hey, I've won everything. We're going to win this one. Don't worry about it. So he's overconfident. And that overconfidence allowed him to lose this very important battle and lose it big. Lose it big. At the end, he personally apologized to each of the soldiers for having led them into this terrible loss. Now, at that time, it wasn't Grant who was on the other side. At that time, the North had an opportunity that it lost. And that was that it allowed Lee to leave with his damaged and wounded soldiers and didn't follow them and finish them off. So, again, Lincoln fires his head of the military and hires somebody else, ultimately hiring Grant. But this battle was so crucial. Ultimately, it was so bad. The other day somebody asked me the question, what did they do with the bodies? Some of these battles were so bad that they buried them right there. And this one was so bad that a portion of the field where they had fought was kind of dedicated to be a graveyard. They basically buried all of these soldiers in that area because it would have been a monumental task to take all of those bodies and take them someplace else. So they decide that they're going to dedicate this portion of the field as a cemetery. And they invite Lincoln to come over. And back then, when you had politicians, they were going to give speeches. Some of those speeches were 3, 4, 5 hours long. I mean, these people could talk. And they could talk and talk and talk. And obviously, when you invite the president to come, he's supposed to deliver the most important, the best speech, the longest speech. So before Lincoln spoke, there was this politician that had spoken for a long time. And now it's Lincoln's turn to talk. And he gets up, and he had arrived in the train. Come on in, put your stuff in. He had arrived in the train, and he had this habit of wearing top hats. Okay, those big, round hats. And in the train, he kind of grabbed a piece of paper and wrote notes that he kept inside his hat. So he takes off his hat, he takes the notes out, he puts it back on, and he delivers a speech that's no longer than 5 minutes. And that's the famous speech that we call the Gettysburg Address. Now, I have a complete copy of it right here. Just to show you how short his speech was. It was very short, but yet it is still considered one of the most powerful speeches ever given by any president of the United States. It was very short, yet very powerful, which leads me to tell you, it doesn't matter how long you talk or how long you write. If what you write has a lot of content, it's very powerful and it stays a long time. It starts, fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this, but in a greater sense, We cannot consecrate. We cannot hollow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. It was delivered on November 19th, 1863. So we're 8 days away from the commemoration or from the anniversary of this great speech. But if you think about it, he's saying, look, all men are created equal. African slaves and white Americans are created equal. They are engaged, I apologize. We are engaged in a fight to test whether a nation which is dedicated on the proposition that all men are created equal is going to last. So if we win, if the North wins, it will last. If we lose, that consecration, that type of nation will disappear from the earth. In other words, the kings of the world will be right. And we will have been wrong to have a nation that is led by the people and for the people. So here, Lincoln brings all of the motivation together for the purpose of finishing the war. Are we all on chapter 16, section 5? All right, great. And that will be the end of